if your child-free or, have a child decision was one where it was really hard and you committed to one path, sure, you can come up with reasons that justify your path. But in truth, all that happened was that you committed to one of the paths and you made that better for you.
I'm Keltie Maguire, and you're listening to the Kids Are Childfree podcast. Hello, and welcome to the Kids Are Childfree podcast. Okay, I have to say, every once in a while, I reach out to someone that I just think is so cool that I am like crossing my fingers and toes that they A, respond to my email, and B, say yes to joining me as a guest on the Kids Are Childfree podcast. And this guest today did both of those things. And I am so thrilled to be bringing you this conversation with her. Now, I first came across today's guest, who is Ruth Chang, when I came across her TED Talk called How to Make Hard Choices, and was just fascinated by what she shared. And I thought, we have not had a philosopher onto the podcast, and that is exactly who Dr. Ruth Chang is. She is a philosopher amongst many other things. And so we're going to be talking all about hard choices, specifically this very hard choice of whether or not to have kids through a philosophical lens today, which makes me feel much smarter than I probably am. Ruth Chang holds the chair of jurisprudence at the University of Oxford. Her expertise concerns philosophical questions relating to the nature of value conflict, decision-making, rationality, love, and human agency. Ruth has shared her research in public venues, including radio, television, and newspaper outlets such as the National Public Radio, the BBC, National Geographic, and the New York Times. The institutions she lectured at or consulted for include Google, the CIA, the World Bank, the US Navy, the Bhutan government, Big Pharma, and many businesses and financial institutions. Her TED Talk on hard choices has over 9 million views, and she is a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. Ruth, Dr. Chang, thank you so much for being here. I am just honored to have this conversation with you today. As I'll probably share a few times in this episode, I have never spoken with a real life philosopher. And the fact that I have one in front of me and that you get to hear this really enriching conversation with us is just a delightful thing. So thank you for being here. Before we get into hard choices, the Kids Are Child-Free decision probably being, and I'm going to ask you this in a second, like, is it the hardest choice we can make, possibly? I'd love to hear just a little bit about yourself.
I'm Ruth Chang. I'm a philosopher and a lawyer who's been thinking about values and decision-making for a very long time, and I teach at the University of Oxford in the United Kingdom.
Amazing. Okay, and since I threw you on the spot there, I mean, I actually wouldn't say it's necessarily the hardest choice you have to make. There's some pretty hard, we can say, ethical decisions perhaps some of us have to make in our lives, but in terms of decisions that most people will encounter at some point, would you say, at least amongst the people that you talk to, students, the conversations you have, that having or not having a child seems to be one of people's toughest?
Honestly, no.
Okay, tell me more.
Well, I find that most people either know that they're going to have a child, or they're probably like you and me, somewhat on the fence about whether to have a child. And from what we've discussed before, it sounded like you were on the fence, but most of your body was dangling on the no side.
Yeah.
And that was true of myself as well. Okay. So the way I thought about the decision was, I think most people wouldn't do this, but this is what I did.
Yeah.
I was in my 30s. I had just met the man that I've been with for 35 years now.
Wow.
And he already had 2 children who are, by the way, amazing people, but they were already grown up. So he was willing to have a child with me if I wanted to. And so I thought about it, and I thought, well, I don't have enough oomph for having my own child or adopting or doing surrogacy or whatever. I just didn't have the drive to do it. Yeah. But being a good philosopher, I thought I should really think about this and reflect to make sure I don't make a mistake. And so I literally scheduled 3 weeks of time out of my schedule. This is in my early 30s, and learned everything I could about raising children, giving birth to a child, et cetera, and was waiting for something to happen.
Yeah.
for the penny to drop, for me to suddenly see myself on this path of having a child. And it just didn't happen.
Yeah.
And then I was able to commit to being child free. And I've never lost that commitment.
Wow. I think sometimes when we tell our stories after the fact, it's easy for people who are listening, the majority of who are on the fence right now, to feel like, oh, just like that, 3 weeks commitment, made a decision, 3 weeks of discovery, made a commitment decision, and never looked back. I mean, really? Did you really never look back? And if so, how were you able to be so committed and solidified in this child-free choice?
Yeah. Okay. So I don't think it's all that common for fence sitters to be like what I just described. So if you're a fence sitter, like a genuine fence sitter, then I think that there are two paths for you to take. If you're a genuine fence sitter, then the first thing you got to do is recognize that the choice of whether to have a child or to remain child free is a genuinely hard choice for you. Right? Don't beat yourself up thinking, if only I were, I don't know, people say to themselves, they say things like, if only I were less selfish, if only I could be more like my mother, I could have a child, or if I learned more, I would discover that being child free was clearly the right path for me. That's the wrong way to think about it, because in a genuine hard choice, what makes the choice hard is the fact that the world, right, the reasons given to you by the way the world is, doesn't determine which path is best for you. So the way I put it is, in hard choices, your reasons, the ones given to you by the world, run out. So the only way you can make a decision in a hard choice is by looking inside. Don't look outside to the world, but you have to figure out what you can commit to. Now, having said that, that's sort of, words are cheap. Can you commit to one path as opposed to another?
Yeah.
And let me just give you an example of something that suggests that we can commit. It's not such a big, scary thing. Most people who are on the fence are with someone whom they love and to whom they've committed to spend the rest of their life. So if you can commit to, Bob, then it shows that you're able to stand behind a certain path, which is, okay, I'm going to spend the rest of my life with Bob. It's that kind of standing behind, resolving that this is what I'm going to do, that is at stake when you face a hard choice. What's true is sometimes, oftentimes when you face a hard choice, think of a 20-year-old, sorry to traffic in stereotypes, but think of a 20-year-old boy who's got two girls hanging on him, and, he can't commit to spend the rest of his life with one of these women. He's sowing his oats. He's playing the field. He's not in a position to commit. And many people are not in the position to commit to having a child or to remaining child-free for life. So what do you do instead? I said that there are these two paths. One of them is to commit to one path as opposed to another, but you can't always do that. You're not in a position. So the other thing you can do is what I call drift. You can drift into an option, and that means, you perfectly intentionally choose it, but you don't stand behind it. So when you commit to something, you actually add value to that option. I stand behind being child-free, and that makes being child-free best for me. If you can't do that, then you can drift into, say, being child-free. You continue on, you dip your toe into that path, and you see whether, as you carry on, you can commit to that path. So this is like, I think you said in one of your podcasts, the confidence comes after the choice. And I think I would agree with that, but I wanted to amend the idea that sometimes the confidence or the commitment can come at the choice or before the choice. Yeah. But sometimes it can't. And when it can't, when you dip your toe into a certain path, that confidence may come. That is, the commitment may come.
Yeah.
So I have lots of people who, come to me and talk about career choices and so on. They just don't know what to do and so on. So some of them, the right thing for them, because they can't commit to one path as opposed to another, is to dip their toe into one of the career paths. And so, many people think, oh, should I be a lawyer? So they want to dip their toe into being into law school. So that, you buy the books, you go to law school, you see how it fits, and you may find that you're able to commit to being a lawyer.
Yeah.
You can imagine that life and resolve that that's the life for you.
Yeah.
And sometimes you can't, though. Right. But there's no easy recipe here. This is the complexity of human life.
Yeah. I have so many different questions. And I want to say, first of all, I just really appreciate you validating that. And I say this all the time, but it's nice to hear it from someone who's not me. I'm sure people appreciate that. The fact that you're stuck with this decision, the problem is not you. The fact it's a complex decision. And I know and we'll of course, I'm sure talk about some of the things in the TED Talk. And if we talk about the TED Talk, I just want to mention, we'll be linking to the TED Talk in the show notes that you made, that you gave about hard choices. But there are merits to both, right? And that is part of what makes it hard. The fact that it's not like one is clearly better than the other. So first of all, I just want to appreciate you validating the fact, it is, I think I would argue, totally normal to be evaluating this big decision if you don't have that inherent sense of just knowing that some people seem to have. That's not the people listening. Now, I want to point out, when it comes to this decision, people feel like it's different. So I like that you said, for example, you maybe have committed to a partner. I'm going to be my client right now who's going to say to me, or somebody listening, yeah, but I can always divorce my partner if things don't work out, or if that's a big move. So what would you say to someone who says, but this is more final or finite, especially if I decide to have kids? Because what I hear from a lot of people, so I would say it's half-half. Some people say I'm just bad at decisions, and this is the king or queen of all decisions. Other people tell me I'm actually really good at making decisions in virtually every other area of my life. I was decisive about my career. I was decisive about my partner. I know what I want to have for dinner tonight, but this feels different. So I realize I kind of have baked 4 questions into one, but this idea that this feels different and we can't apply the same line of thinking, what would you say to that?
I would say that that's a mistake.
Okay.
A hard choice. And you put it nicely. Look, a hard choice is one where you've got these two options. One's better in some ways, the other one's better in other ways. But overall, there's no clear, this one's better overall, right? And it doesn't matter what that choice is about. For some people, it's going to be about career paths. For others, it's going to be about, should I live in the city or the country? For others, it'll be about, should I tell my best friend that her husband is cheating on her?
That's a hard choice. Yeah.
The structure is exactly the same. How it lands with you depends on you, what you're like, right? So some people find career choices very easy because they've had this long history of, I don't know, you come from a legal family or a family of doctors and medicine all around. And of course, you're going to be a doctor. You're going to be in the medical field. Right? And so the choice of medicine versus, say, graphic arts, not hard. So the fact that some choices strike us as especially difficult has to do with us, but the structure of the choice is the same, regardless of what it's about. Okay. One's better in some respects, the other's better in other respects, but there's no clear answer as to which is better overall.
Okay.
Now, on the question of, I agree with you. Lots of people come to me too saying, I'm such a bad decision maker.
Do you hear that a lot, by the way?
Oh, yes.
Okay.
And I think that what they have in mind is, they assume what it is to be a good decision maker, and they have a certain model of what it is to be a good decision maker that I don't think is right. And the model they have is, sometimes I call it the view from Mount Olympus, or the heavenly model. So they fancy themselves a bit as gods, right? In order to be a good decision maker, I have to be like a god who knows everything that seems relevant to determining the merits of these two paths before me, or 3 or 4, or whatever. And I can't do that. I'm too stupid. I just can't figure it out. Right?
Yeah.
It's too complicated.
Okay.
But that's not the right model, even though if you think about it, it's not surprising that we tend to have the heavenly model in mind when we think about decision making, because if you think about where that comes from, it probably comes from religion and science. These are two domains that have outsized influence on the way we think about how to live our lives. And both of them involve the assumption that, for any question, there's a right answer, right? There's a particular way you ought to behave according to religion. And science, there's just facts. And your job is to discover what the facts are. And so we take these models about, human existence and translate them over to our private lives and the decisions we have to make about how to live.
Yeah.
But those models aren't the right way to think about decision making. We have to come down from Mount Olympus and see what the actual circumstances are that we're involved in.
Yeah.
Let me put it another way. That suppose you're on the fence.
Yeah.
Should I have a child? Should I remain child-free? You're hitting your 40s, TikTok, you got to make a decision. For some people, I'm not saying for all people, but for some people, the truth of the matter is that even from the point of view of Mount Olympus or from the heavens, right? A God who could see the two different futures you would have, one child for you, one with a child, would say, oh, that's a hard choice. So even God would say, this is a hard choice. And why would God say that? Because the two lives, your two possible futures, are just very different.
Yeah.
One's better in some ways, the other's better in other ways, but one's not better overall.
Yeah.
And so that's why it's up to you to figure out which of these two different paths to embark on.
Yeah. I like what you said about like how we think about decisions, because I honestly think this is, and I'd be curious your take. Of course, I'd love for you to validate me, but I'll be okay if you don't. I don't think so much when we're struggling with decisions, it's about the decision itself. It's what I refer to them as decision mindsets. And it's this sort of idea that there's a right and a wrong path, that one path will lead to joy and happiness and fulfillment, and the other will lead to lifelong misery. The idea that there is a predestined right choice or what have you. I probably could come up with other examples, but it's actually how we think about the decisions. That's why I call them decision mindsets, and the way we're approaching it with this idea that there's something that's been, written by the gods, as you will say, that from Mount Olympus, we can see what's right or wrong. And it's our job to figure out what that is. And I think, especially if you're on the fence, to your point, they're different choices, but there's maybe not one being better than the other.
Absolutely. So in my research, I actually try to give a name to that phenomenon. And I say, in hard choices, your options are not better than each other, not equally good. They can be compared. They are what I call on a par. That is qualitatively different, kind of, in some intuitive sense, in the same neighborhood of overall value, but neither is better than the other. They're not equally good. Right? So when you face options that are on a par, what that means is that the reasons for choosing one as opposed to the other, given to you by the way the world is, they've run out.
Yeah.
So you've got to find your reasons or your values inside you. You've got to generate a reason to choose one path or the other. And you do that through yourself by standing behind something.
Okay.
In the same way that you stand behind, you resolve, Bob is the one I'm going to spend the rest of my life.
Okay. I want to go back to this in a second. I have one other thing I want to ask you about that you mentioned. You talked about this term drift, like we drift towards or into a decision. I feel like a lot of times and maybe that not an exact term has been used, but we talk about kind of like falling into something, or like we'll wait and see what happens, where life takes me approach. It's, I think, kind of looked down with disdain. Like that's not the best thing to do. We should be more active and proactive in a decision. correct me if I'm wrong, but what I'm hearing for you is that could be a tactic, is to drift, or
Absolutely.
it's like, it's okay that we do that.
It's really okay to drift. So if you're a fence sitter and you're in your 20s or 30s, sit on the fence. I mean, if you're unable to commit to one or the other, if you really can't stand behind one option, you sit on the fence. Maybe you drift into, I mean, it's a little hard to drift into having a child. You can, but it's the riskier thing to do.
Yes.
Because I think most of us would agree is successful parenting requires commitment as opposed to drifting, but many people drift into parenthood.
Yeah.
You drift into one of the options. I want to be neutral. It could be either. And then you live that option and you see, can I stand behind this?
Yeah.
And that's okay. We're not creatures who are capable of putting ourselves behind things at the drop of a hat.
Yeah.
It's a real thing, standing behind something.
Yeah.
And it's a real thing because what it does is it changes the values you have going forward. It actually changes what reasons you have to do things.
Yeah. It's interesting because it kind of reminds me of what we talk about, or you'd mentioned me referring to like confidence coming on the other side of a decision, and maybe it comes at the point of the decision and maybe it comes before. And it reminds me when you talk about sort of drifting towards or into something, is that this is something that takes time. And I think this is another, we can call it decision-making mindset or fallacy, if you will, is the idea that a decision happens in an instant. And for some people, it sounds like for you, maybe I don't want to say it was instantaneous because it was the culmination of those 3 weeks, plus I'm guessing everything that came before. But the idea that we're going to suddenly, the clouds and heavens will part, Mount Olympus, the message comes down. For most people, it is more gradual and it does take time because, as you say, and again, I really appreciate like the validation you're giving to the fact, hey, this is a big decision. It's okay to drift for a time and to sort of see what may come, if you will.
Yeah. I mean, think about commitments that are more ordinary commitments to lovers, partners in human life.
Yeah.
We tend not to just decide, despite Hollywood movies, right?
Yeah.
There's a long process. You date for a while, and then maybe you move in together and you're not even committed then.
Yeah.
And then you might even surprise yourself 10 years into the relationship, although you say to yourself, I'm kind of, looking out to see if there's anyone better, or, I'm not completely in this. You might actually wake up one day and realize that you have been committed to this for many, many years.
Yeah.
So commitment is really, it's just a fact about how we stand in relation to something. And sometimes we're not even aware of how we stand in relation to the thing.
Okay, I wanted to take a second and share details on a couple of events we have happening this month, because earlier this year, I've kicked off what I'm calling my Kids or Child-Free Support Series. I also have a Confidently Child-Free Support Series, and I wanted to share a little bit about what the support series is, or I should say are, since we have 2 of them now. These are monthly events around different topics to either help you get off the fence if you're stuck trying to figure out whether kids or child-free is the path for you, or in the case of our Confidently Child-Free Support Series, this is for those of you who have chosen or are pretty close to choosing that child-free path, but want to solidify your confidence that this is indeed the right path for you. So in other words, if you are looking for support with your decision, whether you're still on the fence or perhaps you've chosen that child-free path, these events are going to tackle different aspects of your kids or child-free decision in the areas where you're needing support most. We've got 2 events happening this month. So for those of you who are on the fence, truly still on the fence about kids, we have a session happening on March 24th about navigating difficult emotions. This is all about how you manage those feelings you may be feeling of grief or anxiety or sadness as you are grappling with the kids or child-free choice. And for those of you who are pretty sure that child-free is the path for you or have already chosen that path, our session on March 25th is all about regret-proofing your life and how you can finally put that fear of regret that perhaps you were still actually making the wrong choice in choosing child-free, how you can put that aside and truly, joyfully embrace the child-free path. If you want to check out our 2 respective support series sessions, I will include the links for both of those in the show notes of today's episode. You can also find info on both support series at kidsorchildfree.com. Sessions are $45 each. You will also get access to a dedicated Slack group. We have one for each of the Kids or Child Free, as well as Confidently Child Free support series. So that way you can connect with others who are in that same boat as you. We have conversation. I share different reflection prompts outside of the session itself for the duration of the 6 months of the series. And otherwise, again, we have other events happening if the March dates or topics don't interest you. So be sure to check out info on both of those support series at kidsorchildfree.com or in the show notes of today's episode. Okay, so tell us more about how this all works then, because you use this term in relation to something, how we stand in relation to something, and how getting behind something. So how do we get behind and kind of navigate and make this decision? Do you have a few kind of key tips of how someone might do this, or what that means? Spell it out for us.
Well, I can tell you what it's not. So many people will think, oh yeah, okay, commit, stand behind something. And then they will start to look for reasons to commit to, say, Bob, right? Or to, and they list all the pros. And then they have the cons, and they think, oh, well, I can answer the cons, or the cons aren't so strong. And right. So they start to ratiocinate about what to do, as if the question of whether to commit is a choice in the same way whether to have a bagel or cereal for breakfast. Right? You think of the pros and cons. No, commitment is something different. It's not necessarily a conscious, deliberate choice. It's just something you do, right? You resolve that you're now going to spend your life with Bob, right? And like you say, it doesn't happen in an instant. It's something that can be gradual, in the same way that, I think if you talk to many parents, they'll say things like, yeah, when I decided to have a child, all of the things that I cared about before, like, late night carousing with my chums and that Lamborghini I always wanted since I was 12, they just diminish in importance. You don't really have reasons to do them anymore. So the thing that's important about commitment is that your values and your reasons change once you commit to something. And I don't want to make this too academic. It's actually a very intuitive idea that when you stand behind something, it could be a project, saving democracy or the whales or whatever it is, the values you have going forward change. What matters to you changes.
Yeah. It's interesting because, even listening to your TED Talk and hearing you, and I'm starting to sense a little bit of what that difference is that you're trying to emphasize. But I think how is this different than justification, right? We talk about how it in that kind of confirmation bias that we have, where we lean into and say, this is good because I chose it, and only focus on those pros, and kind of turning out of, I guess, self-preservation, turning a blind eye to maybe all the reasons why you wouldn't have done something before. At first I thought, oh, those things all sound like the same thing, but I'm hearing this is a little bit different. Or is it the same as justifying things such that, for example, me having chosen child-free, I can now look and say, oh my gosh, what a mess the world is in. And this is why I've chosen child-free. And yes, this is, whereas if I'd chosen to have kids, I probably could say, what a mess the world is. I need to raise great humans to be able to have goodness in this world. So on either side of the decision, you're going to be able to somehow find reason for it. Is that what we're talking about, or is it something else?
It's something else.
Okay.
But you describe is very common. So if you commit to spending your life with Bob, then, all the things he does, your mother comes over, she sees, oh my God, he leaves his dirty underwear on the floor, he doesn't do the dishes, he's all these negatives about Bob. Right? You can recognize them too, but you see them through a lens of commitment where you've made him best for you.
Yeah.
Right? So when you commit to something, you actually give it value that it didn't have before, but it's value for you. And you can ex post rationalize the path you've taken by saying, thank God I went with Bob instead of Adam, because look at Adam, he's a bum now and an alcoholic, and right. You can do that.
Mm-hmm.
But the truth of the matter is, at the time that you had to decide between Bob and Adam, suppose, right, it's you who made Bob more important for you. It's you. It's not facts about the world, including facts about Bob and Adam.
Yeah.
It's a fact about you, that you stand behind this and you add value.
Yeah. Okay. So if I'm thinking right now, for me or a lot of my listeners, well, I like the idea of having, a big family, of having this community and connections. I love the idea of having adult children, having those relationships. I love not feeling left out, because so many people I know have kids. And on the flip side, I love my child-free life. I have so much independence. I have this additional income. It's so wonderful. I don't know if I should have kids or not. I mean, what would be the next 1 to 2 to 3 steps that you might advise they take if they're really just I'd love to hear, like, in real life, how this would play out, this idea of putting yourself behind something and committing to something.
Right. Okay. So this is where academia hits reality, right? Because commitment is not something that I can just give you a recipe for.
Yeah.
I can't tell you, here's how you can commit to Bob and spend the rest of your life with Bob, deciding, right? It's something you just do.
Yeah.
Now, there are plenty of things you can do to get yourself, as it were, in the mood for commitment, right? Which is like reflect on what's so great about this as opposed to that. A metaphor I sometimes use is, if you're really in a hard choice, something I recommend is to try on for size imaginatively each option in the way that you just described. Like, oh, I can imagine these fabulous gatherings at the lake house with 20 cousins. And oh, isn't that great? But you also have to be fair in your imagining. Oh, yes, I can imagine the 5 years of sleepless nights and the diapers and the right and my children hating me when they're 12 and 13 and 14. Right? So you try on for size different lives, and then you just see, does one of them speak to you? Does one of them fit you? Can you stand behind one as opposed to the other?
Yeah.
And if you can't, which I think many people and your fence sitters is certainly true of at this moment, all you can do is drift. Right? And that's a hard lesson. But I think it's true to the phenomenon we're talking about. We want a quick fix. Like, I'm in pain. I have this hard choice, and it seems so important to how my life will unfold. But there is no quick fix. There's only what's in you. And if what's in you doesn't allow you to commit to one or the other, there's nothing for it. All you can do is drift.
Yeah. Talk to me about the what's in you. And I'd also love to segue this a little bit to this idea of values and sort of aligning ourselves with a decision. I mean, okay, so I'm drifting. I have no idea. Like, when we look within ourselves, what are some of the things we should be looking for or clarifying? Like, is there a question I can ask myself? Is this about saying what kind of person I am? Am I a patient person? Am I an adventure lover? Or, like, is it more of a felt sense?
Okay. So there are lots of different ways to get to commitment, or to get you in the mood for
get me in the mood, Ruth.
So one of them, a key one, is to think about, and this is the way people usually put this, which I think is a mistake, is, who do I want to be? Right? That's not the right answer. That's not the right question.
Yeah.
Because it's not about who you want to be. It's about who you can commit to becoming. So it's not about your desires or some fancy vision you have of yourself as being this sort of person as opposed to that sort of person. And I'm going to strive towards that. And I want to be the put together mother who has it all. And now I'm going to take the steps to achieve that goal. That's not the right way to think about it. And that's because of the nature of desire, which is a philosophical thing, which I won't bore you with. But instead, it's this idea of who can I stand behind becoming? And that involves real intelligence and transparency about yourself.
Yeah.
Instead of thinking, I really want to be like this person on Instagram who has what looks to be like a perfect life, and I'm going to try to achieve that. Instead, you have to reflect and think, who who can I commit to becoming, really commit to becoming? So you might have a self-conception as someone who's, I don't know, bohemian.
Mm.
I'm into art and I'm a creative iconoclast and I don't mind eating ramen noodles every night. My art is the highest thing. And that could just be an image that you want to fulfill. But committing to a life is very different. And the difference comes up when, you pursue a dream that you desire
Mm.
and you drift into it.
Yeah.
And then you discover, I cannot eat ramen every night. I really want my Burberry handbag and my this is who I am. I'm someone
Yeah.
who cares about creature comforts. I'm bougie to the core. I cannot commit to that life that I hold up in my highest esteem, right?
Yeah.
So it's about understanding what you can stand behind.
Mm-hmm.
And knowing that about yourself is a way into commitment. But as I said, there's no recipe.
Yeah.
Although now it seems like here's this mysterious
I'm
thing.
sad. I want you to tell me the recipe.
It seems so disappointing in a way, right? Because
Mm.
there are people who are really grappling with this very profound, hard choice.
Yeah.
They're your fence sitters. And really what they want is they want a recipe.
Yep.
Give me steps I can undertake in order to make this difficulty go away.
Mm-hmm.
And life is just not like that.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, you can do other things like have psychotherapy to help uncover the kinds of things I just described,
Mm-hmm.
being transparent to yourself and trying to figure out what you can stand behind. You can reflect by yourself,
Mm-hmm.
thinking about, imaginatively what kind of life each path would give you and see whether one grabs you or fits you.
Yeah.
You can follow exemplars,
Mm-hmm.
people who, are in your life that are examples of each of the lives and try to understand, what it's like achieving these paths and seeing if one fits.
Mm-hmm.
But that's about it, right? It has to come from you.
Yeah.
And committing to things is what I call a pure act of agency, right? It's not something that can be given in steps. There's no reasons that you can follow to try to get yourself into it. It's something you do.
Well, I couldn't have said it better myself. I agree with you. And it is complicated. And, as much as I know when working with my clients, try and create a process of things, including a bunch of the things you mentioned, reflecting on some of these, questions and ourselves, trying this idea on for size of parenthood or being child free, not just like from a broad theoretical, like, oh, the idea of a family, but like me personally with my partnership in our life, with our means, with our personalities, like really kind of getting a sense for what that might be like. And there is no one size fits all approach. It would be wonderful if there is, but I think, we're all so unique, and what may be an insightful moment for some where they think, oh, they do have that message sent down from Mount Olympus. For others, it is that drifting. It's that unfolding is a nice way of thinking about it. I'm curious. And so for you personally, would you say, as a philosopher, as, someone who's very much operating in the mind space, that made this decision easier or harder for you? Or like the same? You don't know if it played
I
a
don't
role.
think it makes a
Yeah.
difference,
Okay.
what you do.
Yeah. And And the reason I ask is I think a lot of my clients are operating very much in the head, and they're trying to think their way to an answer and to a decision. And it's interesting because, yeah, we're talking about philosophy and like it's all we're operating in that mind space. But I appreciate what you said about rather than looking outward, looking within ourselves. And so I guess my question is kind of multi-layered, but do you think there's other parts of ourselves, a gut sense, a felt sense? I talked to you before we started recording about I just didn't feel enough enthusiasm for this idea of having a child. Or do you think this is something we purely think our way to or through?
Okay, that's a great question because I think it's not, commitment is not in the head.
No, I agree.
So the contrast that's important for your listeners is not thinking by looking for reasons outside versus thinking internally by looking at reasons I have inside. That's not the important contrast. The contrast is between thinking and pure agency, right? And by that, I just mean putting yourself behind something, right? This is not a matter of thinking, well, what are the reasons I have to put myself behind this as opposed to that? It's just doing it, right? And, you hear people describe this phenomenon. I think it's mostly fathers, right? When they first see their child in the hospital, suddenly everything shifts. They know that their life is no longer about beer and football, but about giving this child everything that they can, right? So commitment it's a little elusive, right? Because it involves not even language. It involves thinking about something, which is our agency, our very selves, that isn't okay in the discourse of decision making.
Yeah.
We're so used to thinking that decision making is about thinking, and then the renegades come along and say, it's not just about thinking, it's about feeling or your gut. But your feeling and your gut, to me, is all part of thinking.
Yeah.
You got to think about, well, how do I feel about this? And so that's not a real contrast. The contrast is between reflection and doing.
Yep.
Where the doing is, really putting yourself behind something. And I think I have to rely on people's intuitions as to what that is, because it's very hard to unpack. We can describe it probably in psychological terms, but it's not a mental state. It's an activity of putting yourself behind something so that the world looks different, right? And that's appropriate to do when you face a hard choice, right? When the reasons given to you by the world say, I got nothing more. Here are these two options. Neither's better than the other. They're not equally good. Don't flip a coin. So now only you can put yourself behind one path and then see the world from that path.
Thank you. I would love to hear, before we wrap things up, give us a little glimpse into your child-free life. I'm curious what you love most about it. If there's any particular challenges you've faced to date that you feel like are unique to the child-free path.
Well, when I said that I never looked back, having committed to a child-free life, I don't mean to say that I didn't have the following two experiences. One of which was, I see some cute kid and I think, I wonder what my life would have been like.
Yeah.
So I do wonder if I had children. And then I have the other experience. I see a cute kid and I think, oh my God, thank God I didn't have children. Right? So it's not that when you commit to something, you become blind and blinkered.
Yeah.
Right? Of course, you're going to think about things. What's true, though, in my view, is that when you are truly committed to something, you don't regret the path you've chosen. because you're kind of going guns blazing. This is the bow of my ship is pointed in this direction, and I'm just going full steam ahead. Mm-hmm. If you find yourself with regrets, I think that's a symptom of your commitments waning or disappearing or becoming distorted, maybe moving in a different direction. But when you're committed, you're, as it were, the psychologists say, you're kind of in flow, right? This is what you're doing.
Yeah.
And the rest of the world, in a way, falls away, or at least the bits that are contrary. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And so it sounds like then, in order to sort of buffer ourselves against regret, it's about continually staying commitment, renewing that commitment, like staying on the committed path. Would you say that's the best way of doing it, or is there anything else we should think about?
Yeah, but remember, commitment it's something we just do. That's the strange idea behind it, because it's so contrary to how we think about decision making. We think that, oh, I have to always be using my brain and thinking about reasons to stay on this path. And I have to justify to other people why I'm on this path. But that's not so. If your child-free or, have a child decision was one where it was really hard and you committed to one path, sure, you can come up with reasons that justify your path. But in truth, all that happened was that you committed to one of the paths and you made that better for you.
Well, you've stretched our brains in new ways today. I know you'll continue stretching mine with, this conversation that we've had, and there's so many like potential offshoots here. So I'm just really grateful we've had this conversation, and perhaps there's more aspects of this decision we can delve into in future. Before we wrap up, I have 5 rapid fire questions I love asking my guests, if you've been open to me asking them. The first 2 are, finish this sentence. Being child-free is?
Great for me.
Well said. Being child-free is not?
Something I need to justify to anyone.
Amen. What is one particular tool or resource that you think might help people with this decision, aside from everything you've shared today, of course?
I think reflection about the self without it being distorted by desires about who you want to be.
What is one thing that you would like parents to know? People who've chosen already.
That they too will face hard choices and they should think about how to make them.
And lastly, if you could give one piece of advice to someone who's currently on the fence about whether or not to have kids, what would that be?
See if you can commit, and if you can't, drift. It's okay.
Thank you so much, Dr. Chang. Appreciate you coming on today. Where can people find you? What do they need to know? Anything you want to share with the audience before we go?
Just that people should be gentle and compassionate with themselves when they're struggling with hard choices. And I think something that helps them to do that is to recognize that there isn't a right answer. And I'm glad that that's something that's a message that you are also getting out. Fantastic.
Yeah. Absolutely. Well, thank you so much. As mentioned, we will include the very, very popular TED Talk that Ruth gave about hard choices linked in the show notes of today's episode. We'll also include her site so you can keep in touch and tracking what she's up to, because you just seem to be doing such interesting and helpful work. So I thank you for that and for this conversation today.
Thank you.
All right, I've been a little bit lax with you lately. Allow me to explain. So I get messages on Instagram to my DMs or emails pretty much every single day from you saying how much you love the podcast, how you've discovered the work I'm doing through the podcast, how much you love the conversations on the podcast. Lots of praise. Yes, it is wonderful for my ego. I always enjoy getting these messages. It makes me feel really grateful and appreciative when you take the time to reach out. But the reason I say I've been a little bit lax lately is because when I first started the podcast, if I got positive feedback from anyone about an episode or the show, I would say, I would love for you to do me a favor and leave a rating or a review on Spotify or Apple Podcasts. And the last 2-3 months, I haven't been asking as much because, it's hard sometimes as a business owner and as a podcaster to say, hey, can you do me a little favor? But A big way the podcast gets discovered is through ratings and reviews, and it helps us to reach more people, and they really do make such a difference. I also, of course, love having this sort of social proof, if you will, to be able to show people this is what other people are saying and thinking about the podcast you want to tune into. So my ask of you, whether or not you've been one of those people who sent me a lovely note in the last 2-3 months, if I haven't asked you, I would love for you to leave either a rating and review on Apple Podcasts or a rating on Spotify. We are so close to cracking 200 5-star ratings or reviews on Spotify. We're 9 away right now. Can we get there in the next week? I would love to get to 200 5-star reviews, or ratings, I should say, on Spotify. So if you are listening and you have not yet done so, go into the app, whether you're listening on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, please leave a rating or review. It will seriously take you 1 minute of your time, and I will be very grateful, and it will go a really long way to helping this podcast get out into more people who are on the fence's ears. That was a mouthful. All right. Thank you so much for tuning in, and I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day.